This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The last census counted 44 million foreign-born residents of this country. Add their kids, and we're talking about a country with something like a sixth of its population, with ties, links of language, heritage, worldview to other places in the world. Depending on who's bringing up that number, it can be filled with dark foreboding, like them replacing us, or as a way for America to pat itself on the back for its openness, its welcome, its opportunity. In Here We Are, Aarthi Shahani throws a little bit of a curveball. Oh, there's struggle, success, upward mobility, and whoa, what? Plenty of darkness, too, as her immigrant father is snared in a net that's actually trying to land bigger fish and winds up in a long saga entangled with the judicial and penal system in America. And along the way, his daughter is transformed in all kinds of ways by the experience. Aarthi Shahani is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author of Here We Are, a memoir soon to be adapted into a feature film. Aarthi Shahani, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
The way you framed the immigrant identity and issue, because we are an issue in America and globally, man, that really hit the spot for me. Really did.
Well, I'm a little bit up to my own eye teeth in this. I've been doing oral histories for the last 2 years and change. And one of the things, it's kind of a through line, I always ask people about what they would tell people somewhere else in the world about what it means to come here. And I can't tell you how often they say, I would tell them how hard it is, that no one tells you how hard it is.
Mm-hmm. We hear about the immigrants who came through Ellis Island, not the ones who self-deported because they couldn't handle it. That's a fact.
And there are, it's not a small number that went back to Italy, that went back to Ireland, that went back to Germany.
Oh, it's significant. Yeah. America can be cold. I mean, physically, climate-wise, and emotionally. It was an interesting feature of publishing my first book, Ray, that I have relatives all over the world because my family was turned into refugees in 1947. During the British departure from the Indian subcontinent. So we've basically been stateless peoples since that end of a colonial chapter. And so I have an enormous family all over the world. And the emails and messages I got from people I did not even know were related to me to say, I had no idea America was so hard. And I was like, wow, yeah, because you don't put that on a postcard, and it's a little bit of buyer's remorse, like migration is for most people the biggest financial bet of their entire life. And so you can't go into it and then start broadcasting, oh man, did I make a mistake?
Not only that, but also admitting that maybe you can't hack it. That's tough too.
Yeah, there's so much pride in it. And one other element I will say, and this is why my book, it's called Here We Are, and the subcaption is American Dreams, American Nightmares, because it's incredibly hard to hack making it in America. But for those of us who do, largely by luck, it can end up being a really good life. And for me, part of the motivation in writing the book was to document and frankly just make sense of for myself the extreme ups and downs that my family went through. And I would say, basically the horrific prices my father had to pay for coming here, and then the amazing benefits I got to reap from that decision. It's such a contrast. And it's hard to sort of sit with both truths and not just tell one story about America or one story about the migrant's experience. But that's basically what I set out to do in writing Here We Are.
Were there points at which you were thinking, I'm getting a little bit close here? I mean, I can feel members of my family getting the hair on the edge of their necks singed by this. Did people say, Aarthi, you can tell them this story, but don't tell them about this?
It's interesting because I set some ground rules for myself in terms of the writing process. And my journalism really helped me. I mean, having been a journalist for nearly a decade before publishing this, just kind of helped me understand my own power and agency in the process. So the ground rules were this, okay? And anyone who's writing a memoir or thinking about it always leans in when I go through this process. One, document what happened. I spent the first phase with the questions I had and then just seeking out information as a journalist would. I interviewed over 100 people. I wrote this book as a novel, but it's fundamentally a work of investigative reporting. Rule number 2 is write whatever I damn well please based on what I have discovered and my emotional interpretation of what I've discovered. I mean, part of the draw to writing a memoir and not just reporting on somebody else's migrant experiences, I wanted to be allowed to express my emotions because I believe emotions are part of the truth. Interestingly, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who started as a crime reporter and moved on to be an epic novelist, he made the point that he moved from news reporting to novels because he wanted to tell the truth.
Right. Beautifully said.
And that's sort of what I was aiming to do. And the truth always includes the emotional meaning. It's not just ever the facts, which is something we grapple with in newsrooms. And 3, by way of process. So after my investigation and then telling the truth as I saw it, I had a handful of people in my family whose opinions matter to me. Namely, my brother, my mother, my sister. I don't name my father because he'd passed already. I'm close to my family. I would love to keep it that way. That said, I gave them the manuscript and I was like, all right, let me know what you think. And I interviewed each of them for this book as well. And I was, my stomach in knots for several weeks because, of course, they didn't read it overnight. It took forever. My brother was first to say that it really landed for him and he felt that I had told a true story, which was incredibly relieving to me because so much of the story, when you read Here We Are, you come to understand is also his story. My mother as well, I told a lot of her story. And it's tricky when you decide to narrate someone else's life. My sister was the last person to give me the feedback. And I kind of felt like she was messing with me on purpose. And finally we got on the phone and she said to me, it's good. It's actually good.
You were still pretty young when you came, and you were still pretty young when Congress passed Simpson-Mazzoli, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. When did you become aware of things like status, citizenship, green cards?
Oh, it's among my first memories. I think that's what's so powerful about the fact of being quote unquote illegal. And by the way, when I use that word, I understand there's been a movement to remove it from the publication in newsrooms, as it should be. I mean, no human being is illegal. But I grew up understanding I was illegal. And what that means is I reflexively feared something might happen to my parents. This sort of passive understanding that they may not come home was there. At what age? Maybe it was as early as 3. It's hard to really punctuate time back then. But if you're an aware child, I knew we were poor. That was super clear to me because people were coming by to give us food. I had the lunch card that showed we had free lunch and other people could see that, right? Like my classmates could see that. So no, it was really, really early on. And that's part of, Ray, there are so many of us who are migrants who have developed some sort of public voice here in this country. And I think we're reeling from the childhood trauma of how our existence is talked about in the public, how it's policed in the laws versus just our humanity. It's a really painful experience. And even today, there's news about the Biden administration, quote unquote, cracking down on migrants seeking entry into the US and articles that suggest this reflects kind of Trump era policy in a great ironic move. And what I think is it's been consistently the political approach in this country among Democrats and Republicans for decades. When Trump shut down the borders, because I know history, I couldn't help but think, it's really consistent with what's happened before, even among Democrats. And I have like an allergy to the political football. I dream of an America where migration can stop being the plaything of Republicans and Democrats and become a serious issue that we think about and talk about with humanity. And I just don't know what kind of political shifts have to happen so we can free this subject and the millions upon millions of people affected by it from political football.
Well, I think even today, when Democrats try to talk about what's possible, they do it from a defensive crouch, and that's no way to make policy.
And it's interesting to think about failures in policy because those same failures in policy, you can draw a direct line to market success, meaning, okay, it's illegal, but like literally it keeps the US running.
Ask anybody who runs a restaurant, a farm, a slaughterhouse, and on and on and on.
And it's interesting because some people who are hearing the conversation we're having may be thinking to themselves, oh, this just kind of sounds like the standard lefty talk about migrants, and these are open up the border people. And I want to push back on anyone presuming that or invite you to think of it another way. I believe our conversations around migration are just dumb. Okay, I'm not going to make it academic speak. It's just dumb. It's not based in fact. It's not based in needs. It's based in fear. And it does a lot of political football, as I mentioned. And so when I wrote Here We Are, really, Ray, what I was trying to do, in addition to making sense for myself and my family of the epic journey, is I wanted to give people a case study of contemporary migration. What does it look like? What is it involved? What is the psychology, the battling psychologies of the people in it? Because I don't actually think we have that much granular take. And frankly, the other thing I wanted to do, Ray, is I wanted to call out to my fellow migrants, first, second, third, fourth generation, as deep and long-term as your memory can be. Really, the question is, can you remember? Do you love your roots enough? Do you know your roots enough to know where you came from? I want that book, Here We Are, to be a ghost that haunts future Shahanis so that they can't stand up and say dumb things, reactive things against our own bloodline.
Let's talk about Queens, an amazing place, a county in New York City, for those of you who don't keep close track of this stuff, and one of the most diverse places in the Western Hemisphere. You come to Queens, and I guess, like a lot of people there do, just assume that, this is what places are like? This is what America's like?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because I grew up in zip code 11355, at the time, the most diverse tract of land in the United States, according to the census. So my America in the 1980s, I mean, it's what America is becoming. I grew up in the future of America. I grew up in the super multi-ethnic, the entire world converges. And what that also means is I see that diversity works, right? We had neighbors who were Hindu, Muslim, Sikh. Those are three religions that butchered each other as the British left the Indian subcontinent, that were at war. And the divides between them caused the creation of India and Pakistan and later Bangladesh. And yet, in my building in Flushing, Queens, we coexisted. The moms babysat each other's kids. It was fine. America neutralized the difference. And that is an interesting feature of this country. It's something Barack Obama has pointed out and he's experienced, is that while we obviously have a horrific history of institutionalized racism, the other piece of this country, again, talk about dualities. The other piece of this country is that we have an amazing capacity to absorb difference, right? And it's hard to have those two truths held alongside each other. He's done a lot of work to try to raise that fact using his own story, right? But yeah, I mean, my experience was super, super diverse. And I came to understand, frankly, the black-white divide in America when I hopped on the train and went to the Upper East Side of New York City as a scholarship kid at a fancy private school. And there it was pretty much all white, a little bit of black, and immigrant, Asian, what's that?
Flushing only has more people now than it did then, if you can imagine. It is one of the most concentrated areas of Chinese settlement in the Western Hemisphere. It is a place where all the dialects, regional dialects, can be heard on the sidewalks and in the shops. It is an amazing place, and a place that might make a lot of Americans uncomfortable, not because they're mean or bad or intolerant. It's just like a piece of somewhere else dropped from the sky onto the island of Long Island.
I have a fantasy about becoming a Flushing tour guide, even though I now live in San Francisco. And the tour would go something like this. I mean, maybe I'll throw this on an Airbnb experience and see if people bite. But the tour would go something like, you ride the 7 train all the way to the last stop, past the point where the US Open is played in the park, and you come to Flushing Main Street. You bring with you many dollar bills, okay? Just small individual dollar bills. You exit the station and Aarthi Shahani guides you through the food experience of your life. You eat in places discovered by Anthony Bourdain and yet to be discovered. Dumplings, Indian food, meats of all kinds. You will eat and eat and eat and eat. You will have lychee drink, juice. You will shop in markets. And then when you are done and you can't take it anymore, you'll go for a beautiful walk through the botanical gardens. You'll stop at the library, the Flushing Main Street Library, where more than 30 languages are in the atrium itself. And you will end the day getting a massage at some massage shop for something like $30. And it will be the massage of your life. And you will hop back on the 7 train and go home. Are you interested?
Yeah, that's definitely, put my name down.
I think people would love my hometown.
If Americans could eat their way through Flushing before they had to make up their mind about it, yeah, I think we'd be a much more chill society. If you're just joining us, my guest is Bay Area-based author Aarthi Shahani, who reported her own family's journey from immigrating to the U.S. to their run-ins with the criminal justice system. Things are going pretty well for the Shahanis until your father gets arrested. What do we have to know about that experience from all the different sides of the transaction? It must have been horrifying.
As a child, as a teenager, I was 16 when he was arrested. It was really hard for me to understand what was going on. My childhood dream was to grow up and to become a prosecutor one day. Mind you, this was the 1990s. The war on drugs was still raging. And I knew what crime looked like in my neighborhood, and I wanted to help put a stop to it and protect poor people from predators, right? That was my sense of justice. So when Dad was arrested, I was so ashamed. So ashamed. I could not tell people at school. I could not say I was missing school to go to court for a hearing, et cetera, et cetera. And I went through those motions, which I describe, and here we are. As an adult, when I decided to go back and understand what had happened, I did the basic investigation around that criminal case. I've sued for court records. And I would say most importantly, I went back and I interviewed the criminal judge who oversaw the proceeding. He was still alive and remarkably very willing to talk to me. He reviewed the files as well to refresh his memory. I also sought out co-defendants of my father's to understand what had happened. And in a nutshell, back in the 1990s, as I understood it, my dad was a shopkeeper. He sold watches and calculators. And according to New York State, he sold watches and calculators to members of the Cali drug cartel of Colombia. So according to New York State, he was a money launderer, aiding and abetting one of the most murderous, notorious trafficking rings in the world. And if he decided to exercise his right to trial, he has a constitutional right to do so, but he would get penalized for it. There's something called the trial penalty, which you don't see on Law and Order. So if he exercised the right to trial and he lost, he would face more than a decade inside. If he agreed to just plead, he could do 6 months inside and it'd be over.
But hidden is the fact that after doing that relatively brief amount of time for a pled down count, he would face deportation, even as a lawful permanent resident.
That was the surprise punishment. Exactly. Yeah, we had green cards by that time, and no one ever told us, hey, you could be deported for this. But my father took the plea because he was told, just, Namdev Shahani, just put it behind you. Like, what does it matter? You don't want to go to trial. You don't want to fight this. Just put it behind you. You can't afford, you have to run a shop, do your time, then get back to work. And basically on the last day of his very short sentence, he was taken into immigration custody for deportation. And, when I first heard the fact of deportation touching my family, like, Ray, I can literally, it's physical, the memory. It's like a bolt of lightning struck through my body because it was that sense of America's home. Where would we go? There's no country my parents have lived in longer than America. My name is Aarthi Shahani. Back then, I called myself Artie. And I called myself Artie. It's because it's what all my American friends called me. It was Artie. We didn't make sense anywhere else in the world. And so basically, in a nutshell, what happened was I ended up dropping out of school and effectively becoming the advocate for my father and post 9/11, thousands of other immigrant families facing deportation. And so you'd mentioned that I was NPR Silicon Valley correspondent for several years, leading coverage of the tech companies based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And prior to that, I was a community organizer holding a bullhorn, shouting on the streets in Queens, in Brooklyn, Flatbush specifically, East New York, for immigrant rights and trying to fight for my father. So what I came to learn as an adult when writing Here We Are was that my dad was the fall guy for one of countless botched drug war investigations. Prosecutors spent money trying to find and resources trying to find actual cartel members. They couldn't really find a kingpin. But you know what? When you expend resources, the way you justify them is getting prosecutions and jail sentences. So my dad was a fall guy. And that's not like my take. That's the take in a nutshell from the criminal judge I interviewed twice for this book. It's just fascinating to me because my father, he's passed. And I interviewed his judge after he passed. And I don't know if my father would have wanted to know the truth because he paid such a big price to find out in the end that maybe it didn't have to be this way. Maybe you could have tried this maneuver. And yeah, the guy sitting on the bench didn't even really think that you were involved in a cartel. That might be too painful to hear.
Yeah, he was just collateral damage. It was quite clear. You stayed involved, as you told us, in your father's case. You had to. Letter writing, working the system, getting an informal legal education kind of on the fly, but one strong sense that comes through in the story that you tell. You mentioned that you were 16 when he got arrested. You became an adult. This grew you up in the shadow of this thing, and that's a heavy burden.
It's a really heavy burden to grow up having to become the protector of your parents. And I want to tread a little carefully here, but there are two really important lessons. For one, if you have other caring, stable adults by your side to check in with you, to see how you're doing, to hold your hand, to hold you when you're weeping, that stability from loving, caring adults can really be fuel to fight. And I had that in spades. I was so lucky to have loving adults in my life who were stable, who could help me stay the path. And then secondly, this is my other point about this childhood trauma that went into my early adulthood, is when you are faced with a crisis and you're able to rise to it, pay attention to how you rise to it, to the way that you react that is effective, because that's going to teach you something about your North Star, about your leadership traits, about what you're meant to do in this world. I have a blessed life as an adult right now. I mean, I have a really good life. It pains me that my father is not with me because I want him to see how good it got for us. Whenever I have a success, there's that choke in my throat because I'm like, he should have been here to enjoy this. This was his win. And part of why my life is so good is in the process of fighting for my father and others, I realized that my higher calling is to tell stories for justice. in the service of what's right. There's so much machinery around us that tells stories in the service of power, capital P. And I have a gift to do it in the other direction and to do it so strongly that can actually shift something.
No one would blame you if the scales fell from your eyes and you simply disparaged America. You don't. And that comes through loud and clear, but also you must at the same time shrink from idealizing it. Loving it and seeing it for what it is sort of part of the same exercise.
Let me be clear about the way I love. I don't idealize anyone. Okay? My partner can tell you that. No place is perfect. Nowhere is utopia. The reason I love America, despite how ugly this country consistently is because also it is beautiful. And the reason I can see that clearly is frankly through my mother. My mom envies my life. For all that I've been through, she and I both know my life has been a lot better than hers, full of opportunities. She grew up in a place where she was told girls are supposed to shut up, girls are not supposed to have careers, girls are supposed to serve their husbands. My mother was a vivacious, ambitious woman who did not get to live her North Star because of the context of her birth. She was the one who insisted we come to America because she wanted her daughters to be free of just all the misogyny, all the patriarchy she went under. And obviously, listen, there's a lot of misogyny and patriarchy in this country. I feel it all the time. But it's not like what she went through. It's progress.
It's a matter of degree.
It's a matter of degree, yeah. And so, I just want to be clear. I love America, but I love America like I love the people in my life, with lots of caveats and lots of scrutiny and lots of criticism.
Aarthi Shahani is the author of Here We Are. To migrate to America, it's the boldest act of one's life. And boy, oh boy, you'd spend the next 300 pages telling us exactly why. Aarthi Shahani, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.